Okay, as you know, my podcast is about things before the internet. I usually talk about how what you might think came before because of the internet and how it actually happened way before. Please check my episodes on office communication and dating services for a taste. In this episode, I'm going to talk only about pre internet versions of this phenomenon. The reason being is that it's so ubiquitous now that you really don't need a history of it. You more than likely use it every day. I know you do. Can you guess? I will give you a hint. Do you like music? Do you stream it or share it? You know, it was more a personal experience before the internet, and it was not very easy to share. In fact, in some cases, it was illegal to do so. Basically, ever since we were able to record mass-produced music in some form, we've had the knack for sharing it. I was 2/3 through recording this podcast when I realized this is boring as shit. It's like I'm reading from cue cards and phoning it in. I guess when you research a topic, you get so involved in finding information, you forget that while the research can be boring, the delivery can't be. I want to talk about how we consumed and shared music before the internet. Of course, it was different than we do it today. It was more of an investment of time and money. Things took time and effort, unlike this podcast. Or should I say, like this podcast. So in an effort to punch up the material today, I will tell you a story of how a kid from the 80s or so would consume and share music. Like the Goldbergs, pretend it's 1980 something. You were listening to your favorite FM station. Like most stations in the day, they had an evening radio show that counted down the top songs and also gave news about your favorite band's upcoming release. That last part is what you liked best. You would eventually get the release date of the album. They might even advertise it and would announce if and when they would play the new release in its entirety on a future show. You could record it on your tape player, but you would have to try and miss the DJ's voice and the radio commercials. But not you. You're going to the record store to get it on vinyl or cassette, or in the case of the mid-80s or on, CD. That's if you could afford a CD player. So, on your way to the record store to get the release. I don't know about you, but I love the smell of the vinyl record cover. It was also great to read along with the lyric sheet that also came in the sleeve. The cassette lyric sheets weren't the same, and the CD lyric sheets were only a little bit better. Like it or hate the music, you were all in. You gave each song a time to marinate in your consciousness. If and only if you truly disliked the song, you try and edit it out of your listening. It was a little more difficult than shouting at your Google or Alexa, next song, using the skip button on your CD player. It was a little easier. I had a teacher in high school that never listened to his vinyl recordings. He would record each release to tape cassette. That way, the vinyl record would stay in pristine condition. If he didn't like a song, I'm sure he'd record it to his tape copy, or wouldn't record it to his tape copy. Whether you are now reminiscing over my little anecdote about listening to music in your younger years or are of the streaming generation and are hearing about it for the first time, you see that there's a vast difference in how we consume and share music compared to today. With things like social media, e-commerce, and the sharing economy, I think we forget what success looked like before the internet. That's what this podcast is about. It's a bit history, a bit nostalgia, and for some, perhaps a bit of a revelation. I know you will enjoy it. So let's look at a success story on success before the internet. There was success before the internet, you know. We just forgot. Let's get started. Episode 5, Music Sharing. Welcome to the show. I want to thank you for listening. If you were like me, at least internet-wise, you probably got started to share music prior to Napster. For me, it was a few years before. If you have ever heard of anonymous FTP with their leech ratios or hotline service, a Canadian invention by the way, then you know what I mean. But for most, you remember the internet era bringing in Napster, LimeWire, FrostWire, Kazaa, and even BitTorrents like Pirate Bay. You probably remember the backlash too. I won't go on about Lars Ulrich and his crusade. It went on into the mid-aughts when efforts to legitimize music sharing began and eventually turned into Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube Music streaming services. I am going to tell you the story of how it was done even before this. But before I get started, remember to go to Apple Podcasts and give the show a 5-star rating and share the podcast with anyone who you think would enjoy it. If you want to support the show, go to successbeforetheinternet.com and click on the link Support SBTI on TipJar. You can also tip regularly if you come back often. I am sure you will. Today, we are going to talk about 3 pre-internet ways in which music could be shared or consumed. I will give a brief history of recorded music, followed by tape trading and bootlegging, and then I'll finish up with everyone's favorite pre-internet music club, Columbia House. Let's start with Thomas Edison. Before his invention of the phonograph in 1877, music listeners could only listen to their favorite songs when someone else was playing them. Whether in a concert hall or at home, music has been an important part of human culture since prehistoric times. But the phonograph completely revolutionized its consumption. Before Edison's invention, some inventors had managed to record music on the physical medium. But 1877 saw the first machine that could both record music and play it back. Sounds to be recorded were transmitted through a recording stylus, which could create indentations on a round phonograph cylinder, and a playback stylus could read the recording and play it back through a diaphragm and a horn. The phonograph cylinders themselves were interesting devices. Edison started with one that consisted of tinfoil wrapped around a metal cylinder. Almost a decade later, a group of researchers and engineers that included Alexander Graham Bell created a phonograph cylinder made of cardboard covered in wax that could be engraved with recordings. Around the same time, Edison created an all-wax cylinder that could be shaved down to record new sounds. This cylinder could be considered the ultimate precursor to the CDRW. And in 1889, pre-recorded cylinders hit the market. Over time, the wax used for the cylinders was hardened, increasing the number of possible playbacks from a dozen or so to around 100 times. In the 1890s, the transition to using flat disc records began. The recording was etched onto a disc that would be recognizable even today as a record. Interestingly, the dominance of the record over the phonograph cylinder didn't come down to audio fidelity. The main advantage of the disc record was that it could be more easily mass-produced. By creating a master stamp, several records could be stamped in a short period of time, whereas each phonograph cylinder had to be recorded individually, significantly slowing the process. Discs were released in a 5-inch version, then in a 7-inch, a 10-inch, and finally a 12-inch version in 1903. Around this time, interest in double-sided records started to pick up, and Edison realized that the cylinder was dying. He shortly switched to the Edison disc record, a 1/4-inch thick piece of shellac that could only be played on Edison disc phonographs. Shellac, the standard material of the day, wouldn't be replaced by vinyl, a lighter and more durable material, until after World War II. After a decrease in sales during the war, record sales got a boost, with more and more families having phonographs with automatic record changers in their homes. The transition to vinyl also coincided with the change of the industry standard from 78 RPM to 33 1/3, which allowed a much larger amount of music to be recorded on a single disc. A 10-inch 78 RPM disc, the most popular size for a number of years, could only contain about 3 minutes of music, so long songs or collections were often split across multiple discs, each of which was contained in a sleeve that was bound into a book format with other sleeves, leading to the term record album. A 12-inch vinyl 33 RPM record, however, could contain around 20 minutes of music on each side, and this longer playing format began to dominate the market. It retained the record album moniker, as well as gained the title LP for long playing. 45 RPM records also increased in popularity after the war, with most containing a single song on each side, earning them the name singles. Extended play 45s, or EPs, were also introduced, each of which could contain 2 songs on each side. Beyond this point, the changes in record players were mainly in the hardware used to turn the disc and relay the sound. Belt and direct drive turnables, balanced tone arms, better styli, yes, that's how you say it, and so on. These inventions continue today with brands like Gemini and Stanton. The now discontinued Technics SL1210 is on display at the London Science Museum and described as one of the pieces of technology that has shaped the world we live in. During World War I, as well as World War II, the U.S. Congress suspended all amateur radio broadcasts, meaning that many stations went off the air permanently. But the 1XE of Medford, Massachusetts, was broadcasting music in 1919, shortly after the end of the war, and in the following years, more music radio stations began to pop up. Unfortunately, they met with some resistance. Many people believed that radio should only be used for two-way communication, and a New York station was even shut down by a federal inspector who stated, "There is no place on the ether for entertainment." If only he could see how we transmit music today. Commercially licensed stations started appearing around this time as well. Pittsburgh's KDKA is arguably the first, with its inaugural broadcast of presidential election results in October 1920. After that, the popularity of radio exploded. Between 1920 and 1930, a reported 60% of American families purchased radio receivers, and the number of families with radios more than doubled during the 30s, ushering in the golden age of radio, usually characterized as lasting from the 20s to the 50s. You should go back to my episode on radio communications. I have a lot more information on this. The development of popular music is often attributed to the radio, and the rise of top 40 stations in the early 50s has influenced music radio operates even today. By allowing stations to run with less base equipment and staff than full-service stations, top 40 stations quickly became the norm, especially after higher fidelity magnetic recording made it feasible to broadcast pre-recorded programs in the 1940s. Before this, most radio shows were broadcast live for better sound quality. Let's talk about another medium that started to shape for recorded music: tape. In 1958, RCA would change the future of home recording consumption by introducing the RCA tape cartridge. Before this cartridge, magnetic tape wasn't a realistic option for home use, as reel-to-reel players were too complicated for consumers, especially compared to record players, which had been the de facto standard for music listening for several decades. This was also the first time that acceptably high-quality audio had been encoded onto magnetic tape medium for home use. Although the RCA tape cartridge introduced the possibility of 60 minutes of high-quality home listening on magnetic tape, it wouldn't prove to be a success. It disappeared from shelves by 1964, largely due to a low sales of players caused by a hesitance on the part of retailers and hi-fi enthusiasts to adopt the technology. Several competing systems tried to gain market dominance through magnetic tapes, but it wasn't until 1964 that home audio would unite around a new format, the 8-track tape. Bill Lear of the Learjet Corporation, along with the representatives from Ampex, Ford, General Motors, Motorola, and RCA, worked together to improve the technology that had been previously developed for the 4-track tape, which itself had been an improvement on the 3-track model. Other tape formats had already been available in the home market for years, but the inclusion of 8-track players in many cars of the 60s and 70s led it to become the dominant format of the day, despite its initial 46-minute playtime format. By the late 60s, all of Ford's cars were offered with an available 8-track player as an upgrade, and hundreds of tapes were released, with the catalog soon rivaling out that of vinyl. And while other 8-track formats came and went, the Lear tape held fast as the most dominant one. Although the reign of the 8-track was brief, it had been supplanted by Philips compact cassettes by the late 70s. It remains an iconic music storage method. Once Philips proved that their compact cassette tapes could carry high-fidelity music content in the early 1970s, there began a quick rise to domination of the automobile music market. Their small size was a big count in their favor, as smaller tape decks in cars and homes were advantageous. Once manufacturers started making smaller portable tape decks, the cassette's place in music was cemented. Portable stereos became more feasible than they had been when the 8-track was the standard format, and adoption by the automobile industry ensured a quick rise of popularity. An innovation possibly even more important than the cassette itself, however, was released by Sony in 1979, the iconic Walkman. The introduction of the tiny portable stereo tape player helped even more of the music listening public accept tapes as a viable home and personal music medium. The Walkman, originally released as the Soundabout in the US, the Stowaway in the UK, and the Freestyle in Sweden, fundamentally changed how people listen to music. No longer tied to large home record players or large, inconvenient portable tape decks. Listeners could easily take their music with them wherever they went, and because the first Walkman included 2 headphone jacks, music can be enjoyed with a friend. In 1983, cassettes outsold vinyl for the first time, largely thanks to the Walkman and similar devices from other manufacturers. Continuing innovation brought AM/FM radios, bass boosts, rechargeable batteries, and auto-reverse to the Walkman, which continued to present a sleek face throughout many iterations through the 1980s and early 1990s. The Walkman name is so iconic that it's been in use for a range of devices from cassette players to CD players to video MP3 players and is still in use today. Before the CD, magnetic tape, or the track on a record, was read mechanically, with a sensor turning a magnetic or physical pattern into an electric signal. The use of a laser to read the data encoded on the disc was a huge leap forward in audio technology. The laser bounced off the disc, and the reflections were read by a sensor which transmitted an electrical signal. In 1981, ABBA's The Visitors became the first popular music album to be pressed to CD, which was quickly followed by the first album they released on CD, Billy Joel's 52nd Street. Since then, musical releases have almost always included a CD release, with the format dominating the market in the late 80s through the 90s and into the 2000s. Error correction was built into CDs from very early on, one of the factors contributing to the format's popularity with audiophiles. Although die-hard LP fans still praised vinyl, especially in America, where resistance to CD was a bit more entrenched than in Europe, the ability for a CD player to dampen the effect of a scratch or a fingerprint was a huge leap forward in audio technology. And the skip protection introduced into later players would further enhance the listening experience by storing a few seconds of music ahead of time so the playback would continue uninterrupted in the event of a skip. By the late 80s, CDs had exploded in popularity, with the cost of CD players coming down and an increasingly large number of artists converting their back catalogs to the new digital format. The 60-minute playtime of a CD, combined with the high audio quality offered, as well as reading lasers' resistance to interference by dust or other particles, made the CD the primary musical medium for the next decade, with home and portable players quickly being adopted by listeners. Although the CD has remained relatively unchanged in its lifetime, there were several slight changes to the format through the years. In 1983, the first experiments with erasable discs were revealed, paving the way for the later CD-RW, which superseded the CD-R in the mid-90s. The cost of both the CDs and recorders able to write them fell quickly, making these discs, at least temporarily, ubiquitous. CDs also made a big splash in the computer industry, with CD-ROMs debuting in 1985. Further refinements led to the creation of the video CD, the Super Video CD, Photo CD, DVD, HD DVD, and Blu-ray discs. The CD's musical reign didn't go unchallenged, though. In 1992, Sony announced the mini-disc, a magneto-optical storage medium that combined the storage systems of magnetic tape and optical CDs. Sony hoped that the smaller size and significantly better skip resistance would help the mini-disc transcend the CD as the musical medium of the day. But it didn't. A few audiophiles criticized the near CD quality audio, and the mini-disc also suffered from a lack of players and pre-recorded albums, the drastic fall of blank CD prices, and most notably, the emergence of the MP3 music player. Although the mini-disc did have some advantages over CDs, it suffered from poor timing, with the solid-state revolution quickly making them obsolete. Sony stopped making the mini-disc Walkman players in 2011 and all other mini-disc players in 2013, totally killing off the medium, though some diehards still defend it. Okay, this is where I'm going to stop talking about music being made this way. If I go any further, we're going to get into music and the internet. Now I will start to discuss how the previous mediums were shared before you were able to use things like Winamp, ripping, and peer-to-peer programs to share. Tape trading is an unofficial method of distribution of musical video or video content through the postal system, which was prominent in the 1980s and 1990s. Although most used to distribute and publicize limited release musical demo tapes in underground musical genres such as punk, hardcore, and extreme metal, the system has also been used to distribute bootleg recordings of live concerts, recordings of radio broadcasts, original radio-style programming by amateur broadcasters, and videotapes of underground films, and of course, pornography. The practice faded in prominence in the 2000s as the rise of the internet technologies such as audio and video streaming, file share services, and podcasting largely supplanted the need to mail out physical copies of recorded content. However, a smaller scale of network of tape traders still exists as sort of a nostalgic hobby among fans of some musical genres. Tape trading was a postal system reliant pen-friend style nature of an underground network that relied heavily on the cooperation of fans of different musical genres worldwide, as well as the acts being promoted in this way themselves eschewing any copyright to further spread their notoriety. Acts that gained a following through this might land a record deal. The ad hoc system relied on a system of trust, meaning that tapes were swapped in a kind of honor system. Those who did not subscribe to this ethos and received tapes without returning the favor accordingly would become known as rip-offs or rip-off traders and were regarded with scorn. Flyers, advertising gigs, recordings, and other merchandise for sale were often swapped in conjunction with tape trading. Music that had been licensed to record companies, therefore subject to copyright, and released in the format of vinyl records, CDs, and cassette, was also pirated on the blank compact cassette medium and traded, although this was an infringement of both unofficial rules of the network and actual copyright law itself. Many traders would, unrequested, fill unused space on C60 and C90 tapes of demos they compiled for fellow traders, with local bands in which they were members or acolytes of. This led to a musical cross-pollination between geographically diverse and disparate areas such as Scandinavia, USA, and the UK, and their own bands and scenes. One notable example is how initial contact through tape trading led to this trend in the case of the Righteous Pigs guitarist Mitch Harris, who hailed from Las Vegas, and Birmingham's Mitch Harris, drummer with Napalm Death, they're not related, who would later collaborate writing and recording music. Mitch Harris would eventually relocate to the UK for this purpose. The very nature of the system ensured that recordings would decrease in sound quality with each trade and would, in extreme circumstances, become almost unlistenable. Although the advent of recordable CDs helped the preservation of sound quality of recordings throughout trades, the popularization of broadband internet and digital music in its various forms had led to music by unsigned acts being swapped electronically, and therefore tape trading through the post system is considered by most to be outdated. Tape trading was also in some respects an early precursor of podcasting, as the method could be used to redistribute radio programs to fans outside of a radio station's local broadcast area, or even as a main distribution method of non-broadcast amateur programming. That's funny because a show that I listened to called The History of New Music with Alan Cross, he had an episode on it where he was actually talking about where his podcast is actually, or his radio show before it became a podcast, was actually being bootlegged and listened to around the world. That's pretty funny. This form of trading was especially, but not exclusively, used as an underground distribution method for content that was politically censored. For instance, the Cassette Education Trust, an anti-apartheid activist organization in South Africa, used tape trading as the broadcast platform for its political and cultural programming prior to its launch as Bush Radio, the country's first licensed community radio station, and the Hungarian punk rock band CBG used its tape trading network to redistribute anti-communist political commentary from Radio Free Europe alongside its music. I didn't do much tape trading in my day. It was more of making mixtapes for my girlfriend or using the dual cassette player to make a duplicate recording of a tape my friend had, or vice versa. I even used to record the radio, trying not to get to record the DJ's voice, but I guess I'm dating myself. Let's discuss bootlegging, shall we? A bootleg recording is an audio or video recording of a performance not officially released by the artist or under other legal authority. Making and distributing such recordings is known as bootlegging. Recordings may be copied and traded among fans without financial exchange, but some bootleggers have sold recordings for profit, sometimes by adding professional quality sound engineering and packaging to the raw material. Bootlegs usually consist of unreleased studio recordings, live performances, or interviews without the quality control of official releases. Bootlegs reached new popularity with Bob Dylan's Great White Wonder, a compilation of studio outtakes and demos released in 1969 using low-priority pressing plants. The following year, the Rolling Stones' Liver Than You'll Ever Be, an audience recording of a late 1969 show, received a positive review in Rolling Stone. Subsequent bootlegs became more sophisticated in packaging, particularly the trademark quality label with William Stout's cover artwork. Compact discs bootleggings first appeared in the 1980s, and internet distribution became increasingly popular in the 1990s. Changing technologies have affected the recording, distribution, and profitability of the bootlegging industry. The copyrights for music and the right to authorize recordings often reside with the artist, according to several international copyright treaties. The recording, trading, and sale of bootlegs continues to thrive even as artists and record companies release official alternatives. The word bootleg originates from the practice of smuggling illicit items in the legs of tall boots, particularly the smuggling of alcohol during the American Prohibition era. The word over time has come to refer to any illegal or illicit product. This term has become an umbrella term for illicit, unofficial, or unlicensed recordings, including vinyl LPs, silver CDs, or any other commercially sold media or material. The alternate term, ROIO, an acronym meaning Recording of Indeterminate Independent Origin, or VOIO, which is basically video of intermediate or infant origin, arose among Pink Floyd collectors to clarify that the recording source and copyright status were hard to determine. I'm sure that's basically a euphemism for bootleg, but whatever. Although unofficial and unlicensed recordings had existed before the 1960s. The very first rock bootlegs came in plain sleeves with the titles rubber stamped on them. However, they quickly developed into more sophisticated packaging to distinguish the manufacturer from inferior competitors. With today's packaging and desktop publishing technology, even the layman can create official-looking CDs. With the advent of the cassette and the CDR, however, some bootlegs are traded privately with no attempt to be manufactured professionally. This is even more evident with the ability to share bootlegs via the internet. Bootlegs should not be confused with counterfeit or unlicensed recordings, which are merely unauthorized copies or duplicates of officially released recordings, often attempting to resemble the official product as closely as possible, like a knockoff. Some record companies have considered that any record inside or issued outside of their control, and for which they do not receive payment, to be counterfeit, which includes bootlegs. However, some bootleggers are keen to stress that the markets for the bootleg and counterfeit recordings are different, and the typical consumer for a bootleg will have bought most of or all of that artist's original official releases anyway. Who's Zoo compiled early singles and B-sides by The Who, which had not been commercially released in the U.S. Like several trademark of quality bootlegs, it featured cover artwork by William Stout. The most common type is the live bootleg, often an audience recording, which is created with sound recording from equipment smuggled into a live concert. Many artists and live venues prohibit this form of recording, but in the 1970s onwards, the increased availability of portable technology made bootlegging easier, and the general quality of the recordings has improved over time as consumer equipment became more sophisticated. Several bootlegs originated with FM radio broadcasts of live or previously recorded live performances. Other bootlegs may be soundboard recordings taken directly from a multi-track mixing console used to feed the public address system at a live performance. Artists may record their own shows for private review, but engineers may sort of borrow a copy of this, which ends up being shared. As a soundboard recording is intended to supplement the natural acoustics of a gig, a bootleg may have an inappropriate mix of instruments unless the gig is so large that everything needs to be amplified and sent to the desk. Some bootlegs consist of private or professional studio recordings distributed without the artist's involvement, including demos, works in progress, or discarded material. These might be made from private recordings and not meant to be widely shared, or from master recordings stolen or copied from an artist's home, a recording studio, or the offices of the record label, or they may have been copied from promotional material issued to music publishers or radio stations, but not for commercial release. A theme of early rock bootlegs was to copy deleted records such as old singles and B-sides onto a single LP as a cheaper alternative to obtaining all the original recordings. Strictly speaking, these were unlicensed recordings, but because the work required to clear all the copyrights and publishing of every track for an official release was prohibitively expensive, the bootlegs became popular. Some bootlegs, however, did lead to official releases. The Who's Zoo bootleg, collecting early singles by The Who, inspired the official album Odds and Sods, which beat the bootleggers by issuing unreleased material, while various compilations of the mid-1960s bands inspired by the Nuggets series of albums. All right, let's talk about other notable bootlegs, because there's like a million bootlegs, right? I can't talk about them all, but I will talk about some notable ones. All right, saxophone player and Charlie Parker fan Dean Benedetti famously bootlegged several hours of solos by Parker at live clubs in 1947 and 1948 via tape and disc recordings. Benedetti stored the recordings, and they were only rediscovered in 1988, over 30 years after Benedetti had died, by which time they had become a jazz myth. Most of these recordings were later released officially on Mosaic Records in the 1990s. Come Back, a collection of recordings by the Beatles in early 1969, appeared before the official release of Let It Be. Led Zeppelin's Live on Blueberry Hill, recorded at the LA Forum in 1970, was a popular bootleg due to the strength of their live shows, and it was sufficiently successful to incur the wrath of their manager Peter Grant. Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band recorded numerous concerts for radio broadcasts in the 1970s, which resulted in many Springsteen bootlegs. The Pink Floyd bootleg, The Dark Side of the Moon, collected early singles and B-sides. When it released, it was the only way to hear the studio version of Astronomy Domine in the U.S., as it was not included on the U.S. issue of The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Pink Floyd had a bootleg called Brain Damage, which was released under the name of the Screaming Abadabs, which was one of the band's early names. There was also a 1962 recording of the Beatles at the Star Club in Hamburg, which was bootlegged as The Beatles vs. the Third Reich, a parody of an early U.S. album, The Beatles vs. the Four Seasons. One of the most critically acclaimed bootlegs from the 1980s is the Black Album by Prince. The album was to have been a conventional major label release in late 1987, but on December 1st, immediately before the release, Prince decided to pull the album, requiring 500,000 copies to be destroyed. A few advance copies had already been shipped, which were used to create bootlegs. This eventually led to the album's official release. Toward the end of the 1980s, the ultra-rare track series of bootlegs featuring studio takes of the Beatles showed that digital remastering on a compact disc could produce a high-quality product that was comparable with official studio releases. There are a whole bunch of others, but I'm sure you will get the picture. I will leave links in the show notes if you wish to delve deeper. Now let's talk about one more type of sharing before the internet. Record clubs. And when I say that, I mean Columbia House Records. Remember them? Columbia House Records was an umbrella brand for Columbia Records' mail-order music clubs, the primary iteration of which was the Columbia Record Club, established in 1955. The Columbia House brand was introduced in the early 1970s by Columbia Records and had a significant market presence in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. Columbia Record Club was formed in 1955 by CBS Columbia Records as an experiment to market music directly by mail, spurring sales to rural customers and heading off competition from mail-order companies from outside the record industry. New members to the club were enticed with a free record just for joining. To appease brick-and-mortar retailers, titles in the club's catalog were not made available until 6 months after the retail release, later reduced to 3 months. And retailers that helped recruit members got a 20% commission. By the end of that year, the club had 125,175 members who had purchased 700,000 records. The operation grew so quickly that in 1956 it was moved from New York City to a new home base, the distribution center in Terre Haute, Indiana, a railway-accessible city where Columbia had recently opened a record pressing facility. Within a year, the club had 687,652 members and had sold 7 million records, and by 1963, it commanded 10% of the recorded music retail market. In the late 1950s, both RCA Victor and Capitol Records also launched record clubs. Initially, 3 record clubs sold only their own labels release. For example, Columbia recordings were not available from RCA Victor Record Club, and RCA recordings were unavailable through the Columbia Record Club. In 1958, facing the loss of members who wanted a wider variety of records, The Columbia Record Club began manufacturing and marketing records for some smaller competing labels, including Verve, Mercury, Warner Brothers, Cap, Vanguard, United Artists, and Liberty. The RCA Victor and Capitol Record Clubs continued to offer only their own labels' products. Licensors were guaranteed a minimum number of sales, but were held to exclusive restrictive contracts, which led to price-fixing allegations against the club in 1962, followed by 7 years of mostly ineffective litigation. The licensing program continued and expanded in the 1960s as the music industry grew and changed. The Columbia Record Club began marketing stereo records and equipment in 1959, reel-to-reel recordings via the Columbia Reel-to-Reel Club in 1960, 8-track cartridges via the Columbia Cartridge Club in 1966, and cassettes via the Columbia Cassette Club in 1969. The Columbia Record Club was also notable in continuing to issue product in formats no longer available on the commercial market. After the major record labels discontinued the reel-to-reel tape format in the 1970s, Columbia still continued to offer select titles available on reel-to-reel tape up until 1984. The 8-track tape had mostly disappeared by 1982, yet Columbia continued to release new titles in the format until 1988. And finally, after the major record labels abandoned the vinyl format in 1989, Columbia issued new titles on vinyl until 1992. In all three cases, the new releases of the deleted formats were usually limited to new selection of the month titles. Although the country music collection of the month had never been available on reel tape unless the album had possibly crossover appeal to pop rock or easy listening club members. I guess Taylor Swift might have thrived in this era. By the early 1970s, Columbia House had become an overarching brand for various divisions, led by the Columbia Record Club, later renamed the Columbia Record and Tape Club. By 1975, membership was over 3 million. Sony acquired the CBS Records Group, including Columbia House, in 1988, then at 6 million members. In 1987, BMG had acquired RCA Records and changed the name of the Columbia House only surviving rival, RCA Music Service, formerly RCA Victor Record Club, to a BMG Music Service. In 1991, the CBS Records Group was renamed as the Sony Music Entertainment, and Sony sold half of Columbia House to Time Warner, which contributed Time Life's video and music clubs to the joint venture. Membership was over 10 million at the end of that year. The influence of the Columbia House and other music clubs reached its peak in 1994, accounting for 15.1% of CD sales. In 1996, club membership was at 16 million. That year, the Columbia House website was launched. Meanwhile, a parallel club, the Columbia Record Club of Canada, was operated by the Canadian branch of Columbia Records from the late 1950s until membership and financial problems led to its apparent demise in 1977. It was relaunched in 1979 as the Canadian Music Club, attracting 100,000 members by the end of that year. In mid-1999, a merger was announced between Columbia House and struggling online retailer CD Now, an independent, publicly owned company that had funding and other partnerships with Columbia House and its owners, Sony and Time Warner. The merger was abandoned in early 2000 with Columbia House's poor finances and stiff competition from online agent Amazon.com cited as factors. Within months, CD Now was purchased by Bertelsmann, which partially merged it with BMG Direct into a venture called B Music. CD Now was taken over and merged into Amazon the following year. By 2001, music clubs accounted for less than 8% of all CD sales, coinciding with the ascent of internet shops and retail outlets such as Amazon and Walmart, which offered music at similar discounts without subscriptions. In 2002, Sony and AOL Time Warner sold 85% of Columbia House to the Blackstone Group LP, a New York-based investment firm. The next year, the possibility of a merger of Columbia House and Blockbuster Incorporated was reported in the Wall Street Journal, Associated Press reports and trade publications. Although the owners were said to be in talks, the merger never materialized. In 2005, longtime competitor BMG Direct Marketing Incorporated, then the current owners of BMG Music Service, acquired Columbia House, renamed the merged company BMG Columbia House Incorporated, and consolidated operations under BMG Music Service name. In 2008, the company, including its Canadian branch, was acquired from BMG by investment firm JMCK Corp., and the name was changed to Direct Brands Incorporated. Direct Brands consolidated the remaining facilities and shut down music mail order operations on June 30th, 2009. In December 2010, the Canadian branch went into bankruptcy, and its websites began redirecting visitors to a letter of explanation from the company's trustees in bankruptcy. Since Columbia House's beginnings, following the sale of Columbia House to BMG and continuing after the sale of Direct Brands, Columbia House has attracted criticism for its business practice, some of which I will talk about now. I am sure you remember how Columbia House operated. It was, let's just say, unique. During the first 3 decades of Columbia House, it had the most unique marketing strategy. Give the customer several albums for free, although most of its early marketing campaigns required the customer to tape a penny to the enclosed postcard order form, with the promise that they would purchase a set number of records or tapes at full club prices plus shipping. There were dozens of small sheets of stamps that were enclosed in the mailer. These stamps had pictures of the actual album cover of the records offered by Columbia House. The customer would tear off the stamp off the sheet, moisten the stamp, and affix them onto the order card. These Columbia House envelopes would arrive as junk mail to what seemed to be was everyone's home on a regular basis. One recipient might get one type of offer, but a neighbor might receive a more lucrative offer. Many times it was teenagers of the house who intercepted the mail. They were easily suckered into the idea of getting albums they wanted all at once, and all they had to do was buy 3 or 4 albums within the next 2 or 3 years. There were many underage customers who legally could not be bound to this agreement. Columbia House knew these were unenforceable, but they apparently did not care. Columbia House and other music clubs made it extremely easy to defraud them. There were countless cases of customers joining the music club, receiving free albums, and never ordering more albums at full price as agreed. Customers would join the club several times under different names and with no intention of paying. In extreme cases, receiving recordings with their retail value worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Columbia House practiced negative option billing, just like the cable companies, guys. A form of commercial distribution in which services are automatically applied to the customer until a specific cancellation order is issued. The practice has drawn many complaints from customers. The Federal Trade Commission has published information to protect customers against such a practice. Okay, those are the 3 ways people shared and consumed music prior to the internet. One thing they all had in common is it required effort. You had to have some skin in the game, and the music you possessed took time, effort, and investment to acquire. Today, it's easy to install an app on your smartphone and either search for an artist or let the app pick the selection for you as part of a playlist and click play. If you don't like it, you skip to the next song. Before, you let the song have a chance to grow on you, and if you didn't like it immediately. After all, you shelled out your hard-earned cash to get the artist's recording. Now, of course, in terms of bootlegs and tape trading, it may have been a given that you liked the artist, but you still had labor to go through to get the recording. And man, I will tell you, I worked hard making those mixtapes. All right. That's all for this episode of Success Before the Internet. I hope you found it enjoyable, informative, and entertaining. Thank you for tuning in. You can find us on any of the podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I have now set up a tip jar, so if you tune in regularly, you can go to successbeforetheinternet.com and click the Support SBTI link on tip jar. If you're not able to, that's okay. Just leave a 5-star review of the show. It really goes a long way to getting the show noticed. Also, please share on your social media platforms to help get the word out. If you tip, I will mention it on my next episode. Why? Because you are beautiful people. Thanks a bunch. You can also find us on Facebook at successbeforetheinternet.com, or you can go to our website, successbeforetheinternet.com, to get all our episodes streaming from there. You can also email me at successbeforetheinternet@gmail.com with any comments about the show. I would love suggestions for future episodes. You will get a shout out if I use your suggestion for a show topic. All the music in the show is from my band Sideshow. Our music can be found on SoundCloud under the name Sideshow Band 72. So until next time, I'm Dan Vespa. And remember, there was success before the internet. We just forgot.